Now, the public consultation on press regulation closed this week, and soon ministers will have to decide whether to enact a controversial piece of legislation. Section 40 of the Crime in Courts Act, if implemented, could see newspapers forced to pay legal costs in libel and privacy cases, even if they won, if they don't sign up to an officially approved regulator. The newspapers say it's an affront to a free press. Pro-privacy campaigners say it's the only way to ensure a scandal like phone hacking can't happen again. Ellie Price has been reading all about it.
It was the biggest news about the news for decades. A scandal that involved household names, and not just celebrities. They'd even hacked the phone of a murdered schoolgirl. It led to the closure of the News of the World, a year-long public inquiry headed up by the Judge Lord Justice Leveson, and in the end, a new press watchdog set up by Royal Charter, which could impose, among other things, £1 million fines.
If this system is implemented, the country should have confidence that the terrible suffering of innocent victims like the Dowlers, the McCanns and Christopher Jeffries should never be repeated.
To get this new plan rolling, the government also passed the Crime and Courts Act, Section 40 of which would force publications who didn't sign up to the new regulator to pay legal costs in libel and privacy cases, even if they won. It's waiting for sign-off from the Culture Secretary.
We've got about 50 publications that have signed up. They are a range of...
This is Impress, the press regulator that's got the backing of the Royal Charter, so its members are protected from the penalties that would be imposed by Section 40. It's funded by the Formula One tycoon Max Mosley's family charitable trust.
I think the danger, if we don't get Section 40, is that you have an incomplete Leveson project. I think it's very, very likely that within the next 5 or 10 years, there'll be a scandal, there'll be a crisis in press standards. Everyone will be saying to the government, why on earth didn't you sort things out when you had the chance?
Isn't Section 40 essentially just a big stick to beat the national press with?
And we hear a lot about the stick half, but there's also a big juicy carrot for publishers and their journalists who are members of an independent regulator. They get huge new protections from libel, threats, from privacy actions, which actually means they've got a lot more opportunity to run investigative stories.
Impress has a big image problem. Not a single national newspaper has signed up. Instead, many of them are members of IPSO, the independent regulator set up and funded by the industry that doesn't seek the recognition of the Royal Charter.
The Mail sells around 22,000 each day.
There are regional titles too, who, like the Birmingham Mail, won't sign up to Impress, even if they say the costs associated with Section 40 could put them out of business.
Impress has an umbilical cord that goes directly back to government through the recognition setup that it has. Now, we broke free of the shackles of the regulated press when the stamp duty was repealed 150 years ago. If we go back to this level of oversight, then I think we turn the clock back on 150 years of press freedom.
The responses from the public have been coming thick and fast since the government launched its consultation 10 weeks ago. In fact, by the time it closed on Tuesday, it says it had received 140,000. And for that reason alone, it could take months before a decision on what happens next is taken. The government will also be minded to listen to its own MPs concerned about Section 40. One described it to me as draconian and hugely damaging. So will the current Culture Secretary's thinking be similar to that of her predecessor?
I don't think the government will repeal Section 40. What I'm arguing for is not to implement it, but it will remain on the statute book. And if it then became apparent that Ipsos simply was failing to work, was not delivering effective regulation, and the press were behaving in a way which was wholly unacceptable, as they were 10 years ago, then there might be an argument at that time to think, well, in that case we are going to have to take further measures, of which Section 40 might be one.
The future of Section 40 might not be so black and white. I'm told a compromise could be met, whereby the punitive parts about legal costs are dropped, but the incentives to join a recognised regulator are beefed up. But it could yet be some time until the issue of press freedom is finally wrapped up.
I'm joined now by Max Mosley. He won a legal case against the News of the World after it revealed details about his private life. He now campaigns for more press regulation. Welcome to the programme. Let me ask you this, because I think a lot of people wonder about this. How can it be right that you, who many folk think have a clear vendetta against the British press, can bankroll a government-approved regulator of the press?
Well, if we hadn't done it, nobody would. Then Section 40 could never have come into force, because there would never have been a regulator. It's absolutely wrong that a family trust should have to finance something like this. It should be financed either by the press or by the government.
Where does the money come from?
Let me finish. If we hadn't done it, there would be no possibility of regulation.
But it means we end up with a regulator financed by you. As I say, many people think that you have a clear vendetta against the press. Where does the money come from? Money
comes from a family trust. It's family money. And the thing is that I think you have to understand that somebody had to do this.
I understand that, but I just want, people would like to know where the money comes from. As you know, as a journalist, tracing the money.
Yeah.
It comes from a family trust. I think you said from Liechtenstein at one stage.
Well, ages ago, my father had a trust in Liechtenstein, but all the money now is in the UK.
Right, I understand that. That's not my issue, is not the tax consequences. You were clear about that. You wanted to bring it onshore as a fighting fund. But this is money that was put together by your father.
Yes, I mean, not put together by my father. My father inherited it from his father and from his father. Whole of the middle of Manchester once belonged to the family. That's why there's a Mosley Street. I mean, this is actually completely irrelevant because let me finish. As we have given the money, I have absolutely no control. If you do the most elementary checks into the contracts between my family trust, the trust that finances Impress, it is impossible for me to exert any influence. It's just the same as if it had come from the National Lottery.
Well, except people will find it ironic that money being used to regulate the British press has come from Britain's historically best-known fascist.
You see, it hasn't. It's come from a family that goes back to the 18th, 16th, 17th. My family, Mosley's. Yeah. That's why there's a Mosley Street in Manchester. This is complete drivel because the fact of the matter is we have no control. Okay. Where the money comes from doesn't matter. If it had come from the National Lottery, it would be exactly the same. Okay. Impress is completely independent.
Well, you claim to have no influence over Impress, but it wouldn't exist without your money, would it?
Yeah, but that doesn't give you influence.
But it wouldn't exist, right?
It certainly wouldn't. It might exist, actually, because it was founded before I was ever in contact with them.
Isn't it curious, if you have no influence over Impress, that so many of its leading lights share your hostile views of the press?
I don't think it is, because I don't know a single member of the Impress board. I've never met them. The chairman of Impress I've met once. The only person I know is Jonathan Haywood that you had on just now.
Well, let's look about the chief executive of Impress, Jonathan Haywood. In one recent month, he tweeted or retweeted 50 attacks on the Daily Mail, including some calling for an advertising boycott of the paper. He also liked a Twitter post calling the Mail a neo-fascist rag. Are these fitting views for the boss of what's meant to be an impartial regulator?
Well, the person you should ask about that is the Press Regulatory Panel.
And
they are completely independent. They've reviewed the whole thing. Probably what you've done is produce something very selective. I've no idea. Well, the one thing I'm certain about is that these people are absolutely trustworthy and independent.
Well, it's not just Mr. Haywood, and we have a ton of things that he has tweeted calling for boycotts against the Sun, the Mail and the Express. Remember, this is the man that would be the regulator of these papers.
No, he's not the regulator.
Well, he'd be the chief executive.
He's the chief executive. That's a separate thing. He's the administration. He's not the regulator.
Many leading lights at Impress share your vendetta of the press.
I do not have a vendetta of the press. Well, let's stop saying that because it's not true.
Well, let's just take a look at another one.
Produce some evidence for it, or don't put it forward.
Let's just take a look at another one. This is one of Impress's code of conduct. He's on the code committee that would draw it up.
My vendetta.
This is Gavin. No, have a look at this. It's such a shame we can't just ban the Daily Mail. Probably the worst aspect of contemporary British culture after Simon Cowell. As someone with these views fit to be involved in the regulation of the press?
You said I had a vendetta against the press. I do not. You produced that.
Well,
I didn't say that. It's
many
completely
people
wrong
do.
for you to say that I got a vendetta.
But what
You're
do you
just
think of
making it
that?
up as you
What
go
do you
along.
think of that?
I don't agree. I wouldn't ban the Daily Mail. I think it's a dreadful paper. I don't read it. I would never ban it.
Well, we've got similar quotes from Emma Jones. She's the director of Impress. Gavin Phillipson's up there. Paul Ragg, Impress Code Committee member, like Ragg. He says, I hate the Mail, and he retweeted, I hate the Mail. He then said, I couldn't agree more. Others, as I've said, have called for boycotts of the Sun and the Express.
Okay,
now, people can
excellent.
say what they want about newspapers, of course.
Yeah. Okay,
and
let
many
me
people
answer
may
your
think
point.
that they're right. But surely these views make them unfit to be impartial regulators.
I have no influence over Impress. Therefore, I can't say anything about that. I have no right to criticise. You should ask them, not me. All I've done is make it possible for Impress to exist. I made it possible for Impress to exist, and that was the right thing to do.
And I'm asking you if people with these kind of views are fit to be regulators of the press.
You'd have to ask about all their views. These are some of their views. A lot of people
Well, they're
have
the
a
relevant
real...
views.
No, you must listen. A lot of people have a down on the Mail, and a lot of people have a down on the Sun. Doesn't necessarily make them party-pre.
Why would newspapers sign up to a regulator run by what they think is a cabal of their enemies out to ruin them?
Absolutely. If they don't want to, they shouldn't. They should start their own...
Why would they?
No, listen. They should start their own Section 40 regulator. They could make ipso recognised if only they'd make it independent of the big newspaper barons, but they won't.
Key figures in Impress that want to regulate the newspapers have already concluded that papers like the Mail are fascist. You were involved in fascist politics when you were young. Is the Mail fascist?
Well, it certainly was in the 30s.
Of course,
in a
but I'm
big
talking
way.
about now.
Well, you're talking about me. You talk about my father. It's completely irrelevant. The fundamental point is that this whole Section 40 issue is all about access to justice. The press do not want ordinary people who can't afford to bring an action against the press, don't want them to have access to justice. I can understand that, but I don't sympathise.
What would happen to the boss of Ofcom, for example, which regulates broadcasters, if it described Channel 4 News as Marxist scum?
Let me try again. If the press don't want to sign up to Impress, they can start their own Leveson-compliant regulator. Leveson is a very eminent judge. Section 40 was voted in by 530 votes to 13 in Parliament. No, just listen.
What I asked.
If you were to listen, we'd get a lot further. And therefore, the press should make their own Leveson-compliant regulator, then they'd have no complaint at all.
Even papers like The Guardian, The Independent, The Financial Times, they share your hostility to tabloid journalism, and in some ways Impress's hostility to it. They've refused to be regulated by Impress.
I said again, I don't know how many times I have to say it, the press could start their own regulator. They do not have to sign... Yes, but a Leveson-compliant one, so giving access to justice so that people who can't afford a really expensive legal action have a proper arbitration service.
But yes. The Guardian, The Independent, the FT, they don't want to do that either. It's not just the Mail and the Sun. That would suggest there is something fatally flawed about your approach.
No.
If even these kind of papers, I mean, The Independent, Impress is a deeply odd beast. The Guardian, Impress is hardly independent. The head of the Guardian's investigative unit says it would be a real problem if they joined.
You're like an old dog with a bone. I'm going to say the same thing for the third time.
I'm trying to get the answer.
Yes, you're going to get it. The press could start their own regulator. Then people like the FT, the Guardian and so on could decide whether they wanted to join or not. But what is absolutely vital is that we should have a proper arbitration service so that people who can't afford an expensive action have got somewhere to go.
This business of Section 40, which you want to be triggered, which would mean that papers that didn't sign up to Impress could be sued in any case, and they would have to pay potentially massive legal costs, even if they win.
Yes.
This is what a number of papers have said about this. If Section 40 was triggered, The Guardian has said it wouldn't even think of a Panama Papers investigation. The Sunday Times says it would not even have started to expose Lance Armstrong. The Telegraph said it could not have done MP's expenses. And the Times journalist involved said he couldn't have done the Rotherham child abuse scandal.
OK. What they all omit is a full reading of Section 40, because that cost shifting will only apply if, and I quote, it's just and equitable in all the circumstances. I cannot conceive of any High Court judge, for example, the Lance Armstrong case or the child abuse case, saying, yes, it is just and equitable in all the circumstances that this newspaper should pay all the costs.
Even the
it's
editor,
inconceivable.
Even the editor of Index on Censorship, which is hardly the Sun or the News of the World, has said that this would be repressive and they could not do what they're doing. They would risk being sued by warlords.
No, you see, because then if something unfortunate, some really bad person sues, then what would happen is the judge would say it's just and equitable in all the circumstances that that person should pay. What Section 40 is for is a person who comes along and says to a big newspaper, can we go to arbitration because I can't afford to go to court? The big newspaper says, no, we go to court or just run away. Now that leaves less than 1% of the population with any remedy if the newspapers traduce them. That cannot be right.
From The Guardian to The Sun, and including Index on Censorship, all these media outlets think that what you're proposing is a charter for conmen, warlords, crime bosses, dodgy politicians, celebrities with a grievance against the press. I'll give you the final word to address that.
It's pure guff, and the reason they're doing is they want to go on marking their own homework, as they have ever since the war, despite 7 investigations. So the fact of the matter is, the press do not want anyone to make sure that life is fair. All I want is somebody who's got no money to be able to sue in just the same way as I can.
All right. Max Mosley, thanks for being with us.